Hello everyone, greetings, and welcome to the 2017 CRL Global Resources Collections Forum. Many of you have joined us in the past for our virtual forums, as well as the live events that we frequently hold here in Chicago. The 2017 event is a virtual forum, which follows CRL's annual Council of Members, Voting Members meeting, which occurred this morning. It was a lively and vivacious meeting. For those of you who are joining us this afternoon from that, welcome back. And for those of you who are just joining us today for the afternoon session, afternoon here in Chicago, welcome for the first time. My name is James Simon. I'm the Vice President for Collections and Services here at CRL. I'm joined today by Bernard Riley, CRL's President. And over the course of the program today, we'll be discussing several of CRL's initiatives that have been undertaken here over the past several years, but looking more specifically at how we're looking at moving forward and getting your input on that. Just a moment of housekeeping. We are muting the phones on entry or the voice over IP if you're joining in via your computer, so we don't have a lot of background chatter on that. We are welcoming your comments and your questions via the chat function of WebEx. You should see a blue chat button or some color chat button at the top of your screen. If you don't see the chat, you can click on that and it will show up. So feel free to provide your input at any point during the presentation, and we will have plenty of time for some questions and answers. I'm very pleased that we have several member representatives participating in today's discussion, and we've broken today's forum into two major sessions. One looking at CRL's licensing agenda, and the second part later this afternoon looking at CRL's digitization agenda. I am here to introduce the first session, Shaping CRL's Agenda, Session 1, Licensing of Global Data. In November of 2017, CRL convened the inaugural eDesiderata Forum, which we labeled Licensing Big Data. This was the first in a series of annual forums that are designed to bring new expertise and insights to bear on the challenges of providing access to major databases and data services for scholarly research. The eDesiderata Forum for 2016 surveyed the landscape of what we call big data, but perhaps more accurately would call global data, electronic resources with an eye towards shaping what CRL and NERL's licensing agendas should be. The forum focused on commercial and open access data in the areas that you see on the screen here, in particular business and financial data, public opinion and population, as well as geospatial information. Specialists who were invited to present at the forum discussed the major data types and sources, described the challenges of providing access to those major data sets and databases, and focused on potential areas that CRL and its community of institutions could do to help support and enhance access to these vital resources. Through the forum, CRL sought to explore the community interest in commercial and open access data sources, illuminate market practices and the economics therein, and identify priorities for CRL and NERL licensing on behalf of member institutions. The report of that forum is on CRL's website on the event page, and if you haven't had a chance to see that, I do recommend it to you. The outcomes of that forum, to put a fine point on it, are what formed the basis of today's conversation. The purpose of this session, Session 1, on licensing of global data, is to help explore ways that CRL and NERL can help strengthen library effectiveness in this arena. The primary recommendations coming out of the eDesiderata Forum are listed here in the order in which we will present them. That is, working towards dealing collectively with vendors of critical databases or data sets, providing library support for non-commercial providers of data, and providing support for individual library dealings with vendors and data sources as well. To present on these three priorities, we've brought together several representatives, as I've mentioned, from CRL member institutions, and we will introduce them in the order in which they're presenting at the time. For the first topic, however, I'm very pleased to present a summary of the discussion and some of the conversations that we've had since the eDesiderata Forum. So part 1, Collectivize dealings with vendors of critical databases. CRL and its member institutions have been engaged in electronic licensing of resources since 2010. Indeed, actually, a couple years before that, CRL got into the licensing business through the support of the Global Resources Network programs, such as our partners in French and German language resources, CIFNAL and GNARP. In 2010, CRL brokered some institution-wide offers for critical news databases, historical resources, primary source collections, and, in fact, data resources themselves. Coordinated and centralized licensing is not new to any of you, I'm sure, and it involves a variety or a spectrum of activities and engage members in a variety of different ways in the process. These kinds of coordinated licensing activities may be organized along a spectrum from informal to extremely formal, from informal discussions with vendors among networks of institutions, to more formal and centralized licensing and even funding activities. This graphic, of course, represents various stages within the licensing framework, but I wanted to specifically highlight that CRL supports this workflow through a variety of activities, primarily through centralized licensing and opt-in purchases. So somewhere in the middle of that spectrum is where CRL bases the majority of its activities. We make the outputs of our activities discoverable to the membership through eDesiderata, which is designed to support the sharing of information and opinions about e-resources that are of interest to CRL libraries, and for tracking the status of CRL's e-resources under consideration or negotiated by CRL for member purchase and licensing. You can see along the bottom of this slide some of the icons we use within eDesiderata to signal items that are flagged of potential interest for the members. The opportunities for members to give us feedback in terms of polling or comments on the resources themselves. CRL's detailed and objective analysis of the variety of products and profiles of the vendors that offer those various resources, all the way through negotiation, member discussion about terms, pricing, advantages and disadvantages of those databases, through the formal offers through which CRL seeks to leverage the best possible terms, most favorable pricing for offers, ideally with a long time horizon for member institutions to consider. Along the lines of data, and in particular global data, CRL has been engaged quite intensively with a variety of producers of that information, a snapshot of which you can see on this slide. We do negotiate favorable terms and conditions for these databases, including Data Planet, a repository that contains more than 18.9 billion data points from more than 70 source organizations. Statista, which provides current statistical data and comparisons against a wide-ranging array of topics. And Privco, a database that provides extensive private company financial information for over 500,000 companies. So in consideration of coordinated or centralized licensing vis-a-vis global data, datasets or structured databases, the eDesiderata Forum participants outlined a number of advantages to CRL engaging in this arena. These advantages, I'm sure, are fairly evident from participation in other consortia, but they include the advantages of leveraging the strength and buying power of the collective institutions. CRL has brokered particularly good deals among its memberships, and NERL, which represents some of the largest purchasing power, does negotiate extensive favorable deals for a variety of other materials. Of course, the opportunities to standardize terms and use rights, promote transparency of pricing and of terms, and ensuring the accountability of providers, particularly in terms of their archiving practices, their click-through licenses, the ability to share data with other users of the materials. All of these are advantages that one can employ when engaging in cooperative licensing. At the same time, members caution that CRL and its approaches to big data and big financial databases may not always bring considerable advantages. Some of the disadvantages that were discussed, or perhaps impediments to centralized licensing, include the fact that in many of these products, these data resources, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. The variety of producers of this material are frequently catering to markets outside of the academic marketplace. And therefore, they have very different experiences in how they offer and make data accessible. Work with the business and finance data ecosystem often falls outside of routine e-resource licensing practices. And the acquisition of such databases is often on terms that are tailored to the intended specific users of those research databases. There are also variable levels of interest, need, and financial means among a broad membership such as that of CRL. A large consortium approach in particular may dilute the ability of specialized institutions such as business school libraries or the geospatial community to achieve a satisfactory negotiation. In some cases, vendors just simply will not deal with a consortium, where they prefer working with regional groups or selective institutions in favorable pricing and terms. And of course, the speed and the timing of the offers. Frequently, you are requested to license or purchase a data set based on faculty need, and bringing it into a larger network of organizations considering an offer may not be advantageous to that faculty member. I just want to highlight at the bottom of this, a number of these conversations mirrored that of an earlier conference that CRL presented at the Charleston conference in 2011 called Weighing the Evidence, Evaluating Major Research Databases. The presentations of those are on CRL's website. If you happen to miss that or if you've forgotten the base of those discussions, I do commend that because in many ways, those conversations helped shape the agenda that we're talking about today. So what role may CRL have in the licensing or purchase of global data? This is part of the discussion where, frankly, CRL is interested in your feedback and your continued thoughts on where the appropriate role for CRL may be. Through the eDesiderata forum and in discussions afterward, CRL has explored a number of approaches that we may take in this arena. And we have to say that given the variety of institutions that we represent, there is no particularly clear consensus. So let's just explore a few of the ideas and collect your additional thoughts and feedback on that. The most obvious opportunity is just to go for broke and to pursue large database licenses on behalf of the members. In weighing these potential, CRL has been actively exploring particular data sets or data products among the membership to see where the interest may lie in CRL taking an advanced role in the negotiation or perhaps renegotiation of licenses on behalf of the member institutions. In March, CRL consulted with a group of libraries regarding potential advantages of consolidating leverage in the areas of large financial databases. You can just see here a snapshot of a very informal survey that we conducted among many of the large business school libraries in CRL and NEURL regarding potential products of interest where CRL might play a role in getting involved with the publisher and making sure that the terms are most advantageous. And here you can see some of the biggest financial databases such as Bloomberg, the Wharton Research Data Services, Bureau Van Dyke, and others, in terms of the number of institutions that have already provided access to those databases to their constituencies. These major vendors provide large subscription data resources that are commonly used in business and financial research, and in particular, their interest is in some of the biggest business school libraries or business schools themselves. Pricing, obviously, can be quite high for these databases. Members in these discussions weighed the advantages, the pros and cons of participating together in these resources and how CRL might play a role. Some members question whether CRL's success in leveraging licensing with such providers like Bloomberg would be commensurate with the effort involved. That is, if Bloomberg already has the fullest of business that it wants, why would it be interested in renegotiating a license that's more favorable? As one member put it, negotiation with Bloomberg, good luck. So we discussed ways that we might be able to move forward in this arena, in particular with large financial databases. And that may be through our existing networks of CRL institutions and NEURL institutions in vetting comments and sharing information about what is working well with these licenses or within these databases, what is problematic. And we've collected a number of comments in eDesiderata to that effect. For instance, whether a database provider or a data provider provides overly restrictive uses on downloads or in searching too many data sets within a given license. And perhaps having collected those comments, working with the institutions that are already subscribing in sharing those issues with the vendors on a more united front so that we can collectively, as a community, begin to improve access or the user experience to these particular databases. Having mediated conversations among CRL members and among neural members involved, and promoting greater information sharing are all areas where CRL could profitably assist with this type of data resource. There are, of course, other areas that CRL perhaps would be more naturally suited towards the negotiation on behalf of its institutions. And that might be with mediating licenses that are more responsive to the academic audience. I've mentioned that one of the great challenges of databases of this sort, or these particular types of data, is that they don't normally cater to an academic audience as their primary marketplace. So getting involved with them as an academic consortia often feels a bit jarring to those providers. So working towards the higher level fruit is something that CRL would aspire to. But in the meanwhile, we can continue the work that we're doing in engaging the providers of this data, educating them as to the specific use cases of academic research, and making sure that pricing is more advantageously structured for open resources within your campus. So some of those financial data providers we've already engaged. The first bullet point with Business Monitor International, Global Financial Data, Privco, and Statista are areas that CRL is already engaged and has active offers with those institutions. Information on those are in eDesiderata. Other databases that were mentioned as high priorities for our member institutions may be those that capture and present historical data or historical time series. And CRL and Neural members may work with them to promote and improve the persistence of that data and include terms for perpetual licensing and preservation of those historical data sets. So databases such as Morningstar Investment Research Center, a database that is designed for libraries for research and analysis of financial information. Emergent Archives, an online database of indexed corporate and industry-related documents. A third area that CRL is hoping to stake a claim, perhaps, is within the international data structure, with the new providers of data that have not previously been available. CRL has always had a global focus, and global data is an area that we're very interested in working in. Databases such as the African Financial and Economic Data, which aggregates data from over 54 African countries, including macroeconomic and microeconomic data information. AFED represents that it's collected more than 26.5 million data records from 50,000 data indicators. And this might be an area where CRL and its constituent institutions could play a role in promoting access to these types of materials on behalf of the member institutions. Finally, of course, the area that CRL is most established and is continuing to pursue its interests on behalf of you include those news resources that may have financial related information. As most of you know, I'm sure CRL has brokered the academic site license for the New York Times, and over 200 institutions across North America have participated in CRL's site license for the NewYorkTimes.com. This provides campus-wide access to the vast majority of the students and faculty on your institutions, access to the daily feed of the New York Times. The kinds of resources that are provided there include all of the multimedia and video and interactive products and blogs and comments, et cetera, that aren't represented in the historical databases or in the news feeds from other providers. CRL has also explored the advantages of working with the Financial Times, which is really a global news source with an emphasis on financial information. We did provide an offer last year, and we received valuable feedback from the members as to the interest in that, in ways that we perhaps could better negotiate that with the Financial Times in the future. Finally, in January of this year, CRL began a conversation with the Wall Street Journal regarding similar terms of access as those with the New York Times. The Wall Street Journal has been ranked consistently high among our members as a database of interest. And while the Wall Street Journal did not previously have an academic site license model in place, they are seriously considering how they might be able to present this to the CRL membership as an option moving forward. So expect more information on that as time allows over the course of the next few months. Finally, I just wanted to mention CRL's role in bringing together communities of interest in the licensing of databases and in particular data sets. Back as early as 2012, CRL began coordinating information with other like-minded consortia that represents sort of a national level licensing constituency. So we began joint conversations with CRKN and GISC in the UK regarding potential databases of common interest and ways that we could work together in providing equitable offers across those 3 different networks. NERL joined CRL in 2013. NERL, which was previously hosted at Yale University, came to under CRL's administrative guidance in 2013, and that has provided a vast amount of expertise to CRL and has expanded the audience for NERL to the CRL network of institutions as well. And finally, in 2016, in October of last year, we mentioned substantial support from the Mellon Foundation to begin to broker a more international network of institutions that might be interested in collaborating together on licenses of common interest. Those include the national licensing initiatives that are sponsored by the German Research Foundation, the Deutsche Forschgemeinschaft, as well as Latin American institutions through the Global Collections Initiative. And I'll be talking more about the Collections Initiative in the second part of today's session. So those were just a summation of some of the discussions that we've had. And we've invited Greg Raschke, who's the Associate Director for Collections and Scholarly Communication at North Carolina State University, to provide some comments. Greg is a representative on CRL's Collections and Services Policy Committee and has had some information provided to him regarding some of CRL's initiatives and has some comments that he'd like to make at this point. Greg, are you available?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you. I think you laid out the issues relatively well. I mean, more than relatively, exceptionally well. So let me first thank my colleague Debra at NC State, who provides me all kinds of input on things related to CRL and is very engaged in these topics. I mean, first, I'm glad to see CRL expanding its framework for collections. It's sort of broadened content scope that mirrors the expanded content scope that's occurring in its member libraries. I'm obviously a fan of that. I endorse the sort of sea change presentations and changes to CRL scope and its approach from this morning's session. So I think this sort of falls in that vein. And again, I'm very supportive. I'll keep my comments relatively short in this space. I think CRL's, as you noted, its size and scale are both an advantage and disadvantage. So the obvious solution is to maximize the advantage, right, and try to move the marketplace. I think that having CRL negotiate terms and contracts that roughly mirror what the member libraries can get on their own, right, doesn't help us. It makes it not worth the effort. But if CRL can be a sort of somewhat stubborn negotiator and really try to push and tilt the marketplace and use its extensive leverage in what is still a relatively young marketplace to the benefit of libraries and really to the benefit of researchers and scholars, that's going to be where we get the most value. So essentially go big or go home is my sort of thought for CRL. They can be less compromising than the individual libraries. They can be more stubborn and they can try to use the size and scale that they bring to bear. Now the problem is if every vendor says go home, right, then CRL isn't doing much to move the marketplace. But again, I think duplicating things that the individual libraries can get on their own, minor price breaks, things like that, is not as advantageous. Really what we want are the kind of terms, the kind of things like content mining or the kind of thing like you mentioned with the Wall Street Journal where you're moving someone who hasn't really had an academic model into the academic and research library space. Those are the kind of things that are most advantageous and that are going to benefit us all.
Great, thank you. That's really useful comments, I think. One of the things that, I agree with you. I think it would be great for us to push as hard as we can and be stubborn, as you say. One of the challenges, however, is if institutions are not in lockstep behind CRL, and if they break ranks, as I think Ann Okerson called it, and said, well, we're not willing to wait, and we're just going to go ahead and do this, then that support gets eroded, I suppose, as institutions move into that marketplace if they're not working consistently. Do you have any thoughts about that or experiences within your own regional licensing groups?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And as you mentioned, that's one of those spaces where sometimes scale can be a disadvantage, right? Because in a regional licensing group like we have here in the Triangle, it's easier to keep 3 or 4 members unified, right, than it is to keep dozens or hundreds of members unified. But I forgot to mention, I honestly had it in my notes and I forgot to mention it. But yeah, part of this is all the vendors. If we say CRL, go big and go home, and you guys go too big, and all the vendors run to the individual institutions, then they have to provide some support, and the regional consortia have to provide some support to send those vendors right back to CRL or to encourage them to engage CRL. So it's sort of a bidirectional process. And then even before that, we can be pushing people, as knowing that CRL is coming into this marketplace and willing to use its leverage in some of these arenas, we can be pushing vendors and ideas towards CRL. So you're absolutely right. It's incumbent upon the membership to support this move by CRL, for sure. And perhaps what we could do is tap those regional nodes. Think of it a little bit like print archiving, where the regional nodes feed into these larger nodes, and if the regional nodes can commit to supporting CRL's efforts, then that might help keep the membership all pushing in the same direction.
It's a fascinating concept, actually. I think it's an interesting way of kind of exploring the nodal strengths of the CRL institutions. We support a very broad and international network, although many of these conversations are happening in different corridors or perhaps in regional meetings or at various other conferences. And so, it seems incumbent upon us to make sure that we have a strong plan from the get-go and that it's well communicated among the members, so that if we are exploring a database of interest to the members, that's communicated far enough in advance so that when NC State or University of Washington are approached by these vendors, that they know that there's a CRL offering the works.
Absolutely.
We have a comment from Jeff Kosakoff at Duke University.
Jeff, if it's all right, I'll just read this aloud. He says, I'm happy to have CRL look at expanding licensing, especially into resources that we presently can't get through consortial deals. Now, having said that, I hope that conversations about big data might also include how we might buy or license data itself, small d data. That is, could CRL acquire data, host and preserve it, and build out API or other kinds of infrastructure to enable research access? The CRL Data Center, along with the lines of, say, the HathiTrust Research Center relationship on the HathiTrust corpus. So if I understand this correctly, it's exploring more of a concept of a centralized hosting of some of the data that is often subject right now to one-off purchases by the institutions, and there are a variety of approaches that institutions take to that, whether they have a centralized repository or a data center where that material can be hosted.
That's a little like, this is Bernie Riley, by the way. It reminds me a little bit of what the OCL group has done with Scholars Portal and geospatial data. We'll be talking about that a little later on, but what OCL does is negotiate the licenses for data, GIS data sets that are then hosted on the Scholars Portal, which is a robust, well-established platform, repository platform that's maintained by the University of Toronto. Mm-hmm. So that's one kind of data. I think it would be a heavy lift, I think, to replicate that for a range of types of data. I wonder if there are particular types of data that that could be a focus of this.
Yeah, perhaps other data sources that are more at risk than others, or more ephemeral, more fleeting, and don't have that kind of infrastructure to support them. That's possible.
Yeah.
Think about. Yeah.
Another member, Michigan, commented that they're trying to figure this out too, how to build custom portals for data that they license, but they really have an interest in sharing this type of work with others. So creating a framework for broader sharing. Sounds like an area that we should further explore.
Yeah, another model out there for this kind of thing is ICPSR, Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, or political science research, that does is been a long-standing university-based repository for public opinion data, and that's it's supported by a group of, well, probably a couple hundred, mostly U.S. universities that provide funding for it, and they are a non-commercial portal, not completely open access, but non-commercial nonetheless. That's an area where they've focused on a particular type of data. That seems like that's worked very well.
We'd like to move on to Lara, who is joining us from the University of Minnesota Population Center. She is a research scientist with IPUMS International, as well as with the NAPP. And Lara will be talking about the second major recommendation of forging library partnerships with non-commercial providers of data. Lara, are you with us?
I'm here, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you at CRL for the invitation to participate today. Next slide is fine. As James said, I'm representing IPUMS in general, and particularly IPUMS International, which is a collection of census microdata samples from countries around the world. If you can see the green boxes around these projects, those in green tend to contain census and survey microdata, where individual unit records represent individuals, usually organized into households, and including information about demographic and social characteristics of those individuals. And the two outlined in purple are more aggregate-focused data, usually at small geographic levels, accompanied by GIS shapefiles corresponding to the units identified in those databases. IPUMS Terra, in particular, on the right-hand side, has also built some technology to summarize raster or microdata to area levels, thereby enabling transformations across data types. And next slide, the objectives of really all of these projects are fivefold, according to this slide, so I've summarized them in that way. All of the projects aim to preserve this important, rich social science data. IPUMS International in particular has an explicit mission to preserve and recover data, so I've thrown a few pictures in here of tapes from which we were able to recover data with the help of some experts in New York. In one case, sending machinery to the country so that the people there could learn how to wash the tapes and recover data, not only from the census, but from other places. Each of these projects reformat data to a usable standard, integrate those into one giant database, create a set of harmonized variables with common codes across time and place. We provide access to high-quality metadata, including codebooks, survey forms, some custom documentation about what we've discovered, and we enable researchers to build custom data extracts that they can download and analyze. And the aim is really to facilitate data access for comparative social science research in all of these projects. Next slide. I just wanted to recap quickly the reason I'm here. I think I participated in the November forum talking about IPUMS International experiences. Hello?
Yeah, we're still here.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was hearing a little bit of noise. I thought someone couldn't hear me. IPUMS International data licensing efforts. So essentially what this International Census Project has done over the years is negotiate individual agreements with each of the 100 plus participating countries to provide, in exchange, we provide a nominal fee in exchange for the rights to integrate and redistribute samples from these censuses. And so I described some of the concerns those countries have in sharing their data. We limit access to scholarly researchers because countries are a little bit worried about confidentiality. That's a growing concern in the digital age. They're concerned that people will misinterpret mismatches between published official totals and sample estimates. They're in a bit of a double-edged sword position with respect to research because it can call attention to social problems. They also understand that doing research can help them solve those social problems. But they do have a bit of a PR concern there. And the last one there in bullet point 3, lost revenue, is not so much that they really are looking to make money off of the data that they collect from their census or other nationally fielded surveys, but more that they're concerned that outside entities are not profiting from expropriation of their data. And so IPMS is in a good sort of institutional position there by providing this data at no charge and integrating and producing it with grant money. And that is the reason why a registration process to get the international data is slightly more onerous, though still pretty accessible, at least to the research community. So building on that, next slide. As a result of that November forum, a couple things that I shared with the CRL group that where we would like to move in next, places of need that we've identified where data might be at risk of loss or where it could really benefit from some curation, organization, and IPM-style treatment are two. One is digitizing published international census results, that is recovering information from the published paper volumes of the official totals. And second are doing some treatment to organize and make labor force surveys accessible. And so for each of these areas we've identified, I have 3 slides. One, why would we want to do this? What's at risk right now? What kind of expertise or what does IPMS bring to help facilitate access to these data? And third, what does that very high-level overview of what that work looks like so we can think about whether there are collaborative potential in these projects. So the first one, digitized international census results on the next slide. Why bother with this work? I can advance that slide. It's locked in paper, and I'm kicking myself a little bit that all of these volumes I photographed are in English, because part of the problem is that some of them are in Russian or Arabic or French, but you get the idea. There are a lot of tables, official census results totals, in paper volumes such as these you see in the photograph. They contain the world's demographic history. And I'm going to tell you a very short story about why I consider them at risk of loss. As we are ramping up planning to do some work like this and exploring what we can do, the IPMS Terra project has already requested many of these volumes to get some tables in that database. And we know that the U.S. Census Bureau has a huge collection. They make the published volumes available via interlibrary loan if you know they exist. They're only discoverable if you know they exist already. And so we started consulting our contacts at the census because we heard that they would like to trim the paper collection and get rid of those physical holdings. But once I got to the librarian, they're a little uncertain about how to handle copyright if they start scanning these volumes. They've already scanned a few in their international publications. And they have decided that since they can't quite figure out the copyright, those digital versions are only available for internal use. So while it was hard to find them and get them through interlibrary loan, it is possible when they're in their paper format. But Census doesn't have the technology, will, or resources to devise a way to loan out the digital copies. So that's one potential source of volumes that will be lost, I think, to public access if they really start scanning in earnest to try to get rid of those paper copies. We also know that there are many of these in other libraries, and we have used that mechanism to scan a few in the past as well. So I think the time is now to find a way to get the data out of these things. The data also isn't terribly usable when it's in this paper format. So next slide. I think IPUMS International and IPUMS Terra combined have some unique strengths in tackling this project. That's why we want to go ahead. We are starting to look through our inventories and assess the technology we have developed so far in doing such a project. We have these international partnerships with 100+ countries already. We are quite certain that our agreements there cover our right to disseminate the published information from the census results, along with the agreement to publish documentation associated with the census samples. So I think we're a long way there to sort of getting past whatever thin copyright might apply already. And then Terra has developed some tabular structural definition tools that would help us get scanned, sort of digitized, complex, non-standard table information into a structured, discoverable, usable data format. Next slide. So I think that work looks like getting a hold of these tables, whether that means we collect them, we have places donate them to us, we address copyright concerns, which I think are 100% addressable, undertake a large-scale scanning operation, transform that print material into machine-readable and usable data, accompanied by metadata, which makes it discoverable, and exploring financial support options. All of these data projects that you saw on the first slide are nearly entirely funded by federal grants. And so in order to continue, we have to continue to get funding for this. So then the next project, I'll go through a little more quickly. Next slide, is labor force surveys. Why would we bother with these? Well, they contain rich information about labor, the economy, labor force participation. One of the only decent sources of information about informal work, agricultural employment. There's a lot of great information there that is also difficult to access, like the international censuses. And we think that it could really benefit by IPUMS formatting and integration. Hard to get a hold of now. Next slide. Again, we have a lot of experience. This particular processing activity is very familiar to us. We've also been talking and working with the International Labor Organization. I don't think this data is quite at risk of entire loss to the world because the ILO is collecting as complete a set of copies as they can. Their collection overlaps with ours significantly. But ILO has a similar problem of not really having permission to distribute that to third parties, and that's part of why they've come to us, because we think together, maybe with the agreements we already have, we could get countries to allow us to distribute labor force surveys a little more publicly. IPUM's current population survey data from the U.S. is labor force survey data, so we have experience handling that more complex data structure as well. So finally, on the labor force survey front, next slide. Again, this is a work process that we understand pretty thoroughly, and we do think we could parcel it out into sort of standardizing those surveys as a first step, and maybe then turning to NSF and NIH, our usual funders, to do the integration harmonization work. And those are our plans there. So final slide goes back to just the summary of these two projects. These are our two next areas. We do intend to move forward on this data rescue, transformation, data liberation activity. And these are the two areas we thought might be interesting to CRL members. So we're moving forward. I would say we are at an inventory stage. We have quite a few holdings in both of these areas. We have some tools that we already know will work, and we're trying to kind of put all of that together in a more coordinated way so that we can go back to agencies with real full-scale grants applications. And we think that both of these would be a great benefit to the social science research community. We think this data is either extremely hard to use or extremely hard to get at the moment, and that IPMS could really do a great service by making it accessible. That's what I had to share today. Thanks very much for letting me be here.
Great, Lara. Thank you so much. That was a nice summation. For some comments, we're turning to Debra Bucher, who's the Assistant Director for Collection Development and Research Services at Vassar College Libraries. Deb is also a member of the CSPC and agreed to take this challenge on as provocation for further discussion.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me?
Perfectly, thank you.
Okay, great. First, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Joanna D. Pasquale, Rachel Finn, and Andy Ashton for allowing me to bounce some of these ideas and questions off of them. So I have about 5 questions. First, can resource sharing partnerships between libraries that already exist be used as models for relationships between nonprofit organizations and libraries, and especially in terms of a project like digitizing public aggregate census and other statistical data? For example, libraries have a lot of expertise in creating distributed models for projects, whether it's traditional resource sharing like ILL or newer forms like shared print or HathiTrust. These projects have focused on creating networks for identifying who has what materials and then making them accessible to a wide range of people. Another thing, in terms of scanning logistics, lots of libraries and groups of libraries have taken on mass scanning projects and could certainly provide expertise and experience in that area. And in terms of workforce, most of us have eager undergraduates, and many of the member libraries also have graduate students with subject expertise who are can be and often are willing partners in projects such as these. I think that their ability to think outside the box in projects like these also makes us rethink our workflows and processes. Another question I have. The 21st century library has rethought the balance between ownership of and access to information. Would IPMS want to think of itself as the coordinator of distributed data, not necessarily housed at IPMS? Number 3, on this last day of Endangered Data Week, I just came from another webinar about data in which one of the presenters suggested that the greatest threat to open data is not technical but political. How can we better work together to use CRLs and IPMS' already created relationships with overseas partners to transcend difficult current political relationships? How can we capitalize on these relationships to continue the free flow of information? Another question relating to funding. Currently, all the data available at IPMS is available for free to researchers, and it's a grant-funded project. Is this financial model sustainable? How should we be planning for the future without giving up hope for a continued revenue stream from current sources? And while ALA has made strong statements about the proposed cuts in the U.S. budget to a number of important funding sources, should the library community, especially the academic library community, be advocating about specific issues? And how should we be advocating, and to whom? And I have a related question. Grants don't often fund sustainability and or preservation measures. So how are they funded at IPMS? And how should libraries be working with IPMS in that area? Regarding privacy and copyright, privacy is built into the core mission of librarianship. could it be that partnerships with libraries might legitimize the dissemination and preservation of the data and the privacy work that's already being done? And how could CRL play a role in working with IPUMs and whatever copyright difficulties you have? And lastly, I wonder about data literacy. From my perspective in a liberal arts environment, all of these questions I've raised are related to classroom issues of data and information literacy. How can or should libraries and IPUMs work together to promote and foster data literacy among our clientele and ourselves? Those are my comments in the form of questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Deborah. I appreciate that. And I think those are fantastic questions to bring up among this group. Lara, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to any or all of them, as the case may be.
Your favorite question.
Yeah, your favorite question, perhaps, and we'll get to the audience chat as well.
Those are great questions and many. Yeah, we could be here hours if I address them all. I got a little bit of a preview of Deborah's questions, so I've been able to think about them a little bit, but one that just hit me now is this last one about IPUMs as a coordinator and not necessarily, a repository. And we do have to give that some more thought, because I think that is also a way for us to overcome a few difficulties in some countries. If we can find a way to let their data stay at their place and yet still incorporate a derivative into IPUMs, that isn't a technological solution that we've pursued very vigorously, and I think it's because the cost was really high at one point. But as those costs come down, I think this is something that will hopefully get a little bit easier to think about. The other one is that sustainability for the preservation and sort of the long-run existence of this data availability is very much on our minds, and we are developing a membership model structure, something like ICPSR, and in fact we're sort of working in coordination with them so as not to shoot both of us in the foot by becoming a competitor somehow. And so sort of requests that big institutions become members may be coming down the line with details as yet fully worked out about sort of what that gains the members if they are able to join that. So I think for now I'll comment on those two things and let the discussion go on unless there's something in particular somebody wants to raise.
I have a few ideas, but I do want to take a look at what the members have submitted over the chat. There was a quick question as to the country agreements that you have, whether you have a list of those on your site, or where can we find more information about who you have standing agreements with?
Yep, there is a link on the left side navigation bar of the IPUMS International website, so from IPUMS.org. If you click on IPUMS International site, the left nav has something called International Partners, and that's a full list of all the countries that with whom we have memoranda of understanding, whether or not their data are yet incorporated, as well as a few international organizations where we have various memoranda to cooperate.
One question I have ties into a related question from a member. Within those country partnerships that you have, do you have provisions for sharing the data with the originating country, that is the process data that you've put together? And do they host their own repositories, or does that vary fairly from country to country?
That's a good question. We always share the data with the countries that contributed the original materials. We make a CD that has the fully formatted data that also is where the metadata is also contributed to the World Bank, but it has the samples that we put out to the public for those countries. We will return or reshare anything with those countries that they've given us. So in a couple cases, we have repatriated data that they have lost themselves. And the other part of that question?
That was more or less
Okay.
just the.
Absolutely. They don't all put it up on their website or use what we've produced to put it up. They usually have it up if they've made a public use file. So some of these data are public as standalone samples on country websites. And then some of them have created links to our site. We are developing sort of a standard template for a portal where if they wanted to deliver the IPUM's version of their own data that looks like it's coming from their own website, we do have the technological capability to help them do that.
Interesting. And the member asked also sort of the opposite question. If the country of interest did the materials themselves, if they put up scanned information that was reasonably consistent with the work that IPUMS is doing, do you take that in, whether it's for backup purposes or whether it's for additional processing? Is it within a purview of some sort of a partnership to aggregate existing information as kind of a at-risk protection?
Well, the data that we're processing and putting up now are microdata samples, so people download them. We have not systematically put up aggregate tabular data in digital form. I have to think about that. I think we could be sort of a access curator. We could point to those things depending on how this developed, make that visible from wherever.
Yeah, the particular case in question the member was asking, this is relating to certain material from Slovenia, I believe, in which the material was at risk of being taken down, and that a number of librarians put out in protest, or perhaps even went out to try to download some of that data before it disappeared, and just sort of how fragile is this information?
That's an excellent point, because this sort of the published volumes are something you can really get your hands on, but increasingly countries are moving to putting those results up on the web. And then when the next census comes along, they either get buried or they disappear completely. So we are very much aware of that and trying to sort of systematically get those while we can. And yes, I think we would be happy with some funding to be a hub for that information that's at risk of going away online. So we are trying to collect that. As we turn our efforts toward developing the grant proposals on this and using the little bit of pilot funds we have in our existing grants, we will be including in the strategy a way of getting what gets published to the web instead of in paper volumes, and making sure that that's part of what we're trying to preserve and integrate or disseminate.
That's a topic that was of intense interest among our area groups, who reflected that the majority of the data that's out there is fugitive at best, and they tend to rely on the printed copy just because of the difficulties in getting access or using the electronic data.
Yeah.
Bernie, do you have any questions at this point?
No, I think this is interesting conversation. This is some of these things we've heard before. Some other things are completely new. So, great input. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, we'll return to this in the comments section at the end. But thank you, Lara, and thank you, Debra, for an interesting exploration of this challenge and potential solutions. I urge all of you on the line to continue thinking about these and unleash your comments onto the chat. We're happy to accept those and answer them as we can. But it's time to move on to the third and final part of session 1, where we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at GIS data in particular, but in general, where licensing may not be appropriate for CRL, how can we support your individual processes when it comes down to dealing with vendors and data sources? And for that, I'm really pleased to bring forward Susan Powell, who's the GIS and map librarian at the University of California at Berkeley. Susan has got considerable experience with GIS data, with geo-licensing, and has communicated with a number of individuals who participated in the fall forum to collect some ideas and to present them here. Susan, are you with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me to speak. And I am going to talk today about different challenges that are unique to geospatial data and some of the licensing provisions that we've tried to incorporate in our licenses with vendors who aren't always used to dealing with academic institutions, and then some thoughts at the end to about where we might move forward with CRL. Can I go to the next slide, please? And I'd just like to acknowledge Amber Leahy, who was originally scheduled to give this presentation, and she was a great help in sharing some of her materials with me. And then also Ian Knabe and Lee Adams, who are two e-resources librarians at Berkeley that I've worked with to help clarify some of my thinking about this. Next slide, please. Okay, so GIS data has some unique challenges among the data world. One is that it's a fairly complex data type, which can be a challenge for understanding what the licensing requires in terms of the user needs and understanding that data. There's also, in part because of the complexity of the data, there's also a large variety of the ways in which people might access the data and in ways in which libraries might acquire it from vendors. There's also, in GIS, users have a fairly broad reliance on proprietary software that's changing more and more, but as it's changing, it's also becoming more complex. So it's a double-edged sword in that way. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the vendors that create and license geospatial data often don't have experience working with academic institutions, and so aren't familiar with some of the terminology and the concepts that we like to consider. And so lastly, I think part of this is that there's different rights regimes and conditions that require negotiation with vendors. Okay, thanks. Next slide. So one thing that I'm going to delve into is authorized users. And this is, I think, especially important when dealing with vendors who don't have experience with academic environments. So for a lot of geospatial providers, they're thinking of the user environment as a limited set of contractors or 4 office workstations. And that's very different from the way that academic libraries operate. So when we're talking with vendors, we try and define authorized users to include all of the affiliated users at an institution, regardless of whether they're full or part-time, and regardless of whether they're on campus or not. And then I think one of the biggest hurdles, sort of just from a philosophical perspective, is the concept of walk-in users, especially for public institutions, where we're used to serving people who come into the library. It's that same theme of physical versus digital items that I think was coming up earlier. And so whenever possible, we try and make explicit the right of walk-in users to access the data. And I'll talk a little bit more later about how we specify that. Next slide, please. So one of the other issues that comes up is what is allowed in using in a data set. And this also gets back to the complexity of the data and really having an understanding of how users might interact with the data and how they might want to use it. So commercial vendors often have fairly restrictive terms, and again, it's because they're thinking about who their use case is, which is different than academic use. So we try to sort of lighten the restrictive terminology. We insert fair use language and specify that it's for the purposes of research, education, and other non-commercial use. And I think this helps alleviate some of the fears that vendors might have about losing a business segment for their data by having someone use the library's data instead of purchasing it. So having that non-commercial clause in there is often helpful for making vendors feel more comfortable licensing the data on these terms. Next slide. So in addition to these sort of broader uses, we also try and specify what are some of the allowable uses that we can do. So we want to be able to display or have users be able to display the data that they're accessing. We also want to include digitally copy so that people can take the data set and use it in their own work environment, that they don't have to use it in the workstation within the library. So for larger data sets, we might want to refine that to, say, a minimal portion so that they're not downloading 10 terabytes of data. For smaller data sets, it might be on an as-needed basis. We also want to ensure that people can make print copies, include the data set in larger collections of information, and make derivative works. And if you can go to the next slide, please. I'll talk about derivative works in more detail. So derivative works are really important for geospatial data. Because, I think for any data, really, you're not just using the geospatial data to, in and of itself, you're often combining it with other data sets and using it in conjunction with other things, and then wanting to share or publish the derivative that you've created. So we want to make sure we try and make sure to include language that protects the rights to create derivatives for accessibility. And we also include language to try and to make derivatives that are as needed for loading any of the data sets into a local access portal, and then also for archiving. If the technology needs to be updated in order to be accessed 10 years from now, we want to make sure that we have that right. And there's also another clause that we sometimes insert that, depending on the data set, might make the vendor feel more comfortable, is that if a derivative work is distributed broadly, it has to be created in a way that cannot be converted back to the original source material. So sort of you can't backtrack through the data to get to what the licensed data was. And I think another piece of this is creating derivatives that might be, so for a raster image or a scanned map, you might want to include a provision that talks about the resolution that you might want to include, and that's for, like, for example, accessing in a geoportal that you can see an example of what the image looks like. So the derivative works can get a little bit hairy, but we like to try and clarify what we mean by derivative works and make them as broad as possible. Okay, next slide. So storage and access is another big issue, big area. We often have different modes of access for these resources depending on how we're acquiring the data. So for remotely hosted subscription access, oftentimes we'll try and include a clause that allows us to make a local copy for archival purposes. So if our subscription ends, we have access to the most recent form of the data that was available when our subscription concluded. And that can also sometimes, for remotely hosted subscription access, it can just be easier to access the data if someone needs to do a bulk download or something. It can be useful to have a locally, sort of, not locally hosted, but local archival copy available. And then other types of data sets and vendors don't offer access services. Their model is really you purchase the data from us, you license the data, and then you figure out how to make it accessible to your users. And so one thing that we've experienced is that the ways in which we make our locally hosted data accessible to users can affect how much the vendor charges for the data. So if we are just including it on local computers that can be accessed on campus, and you need to come into a physical location to use it, there's one cost. And then if we want to put it on a web portal where people would still have to authenticate to access it, but there's it's in the cloud, there's a higher cost associated with that. And that's something that we've pushed back against a little bit, but it's, I think some vendors feel pretty strongly about making that distinction in their charges. And we also, so it's a fine line to walk between making explicit the modes that the data can be distributed by, because you want to make sure that you're including all the things that you're thinking about, but also leaving open the possibility for changing technologies over the next 10 or 20 years or into the future. So that's something that we're still wrestling with a little bit. It's also, in terms of sort of, again, related to this, we want to make sure that we have perpetual access to the data, regardless of whether it's a subscription or a locally hosted data, and that we try and achieve that perpetual access in the licenses that we write. And then finally, related to storage and access, is that metadata is often an important component of making data accessible. And so we try and, this isn't always within the licensing terms, but definitely in the negotiations, that the content provider will make whatever metadata is necessary for discovery available to us with the data. Okay, next slide, please. So some sort of final considerations are liability. Who's responsible if the user does something with the data that's not acceptable within the terms of the license? And we try, we make reasonable efforts by the library to make sure that users are informed about what's acceptable use or not. But ultimately, we try and incorporate language that the library is not ultimately liable for the acts of users. Scholarly sharing is an interesting one. I think, again, it depends on the size of the data set that you're working with. And we try and include at least limited permissions for sharing some of the GIS data sets with other institutions for interlibrary loan. And again, specifying that it's not for resale or commercial purposes. And then finally, this is something rather new that we're exploring, which is data retirement, where the data that is licensed, if the license doesn't expire, even if the content itself goes out of copyright, the license still restricts what we can do with it. So we're starting to write in some clauses that specify an expiration of the license after a certain period. And after that, the content itself, if it's out of copyright, can also become unrestricted. Or if the data provider is also the copyright holder, then that content becomes available for fair use. Okay, last slide, please. So looking forward, I think one thing that we're thinking about is how as a community are we thinking about what the value of this data is? And so doing some cost benchmarking as a community to really think about what the data is worth and how that fits in with our library budgets. And then for the CRL community, thinking about what a model license might look like. And I think it's important to have both people who are familiar with the subject matter and the format of GIS data. So the McGirt organization, excuse me, or other geospatial librarians in concert with e-resources librarians and licensing experts. So drafting some principles that would help for dealing with providers. Excuse me. And sharing those with some established vendors that we've worked with in geospatial data for what their reactions are, and then possibly formalizing those clauses for broader adoption by the community, just to help create some consistency in how we're dealing with vendors, and to help librarians feel like they don't have to rewrite the constructs every time we write a license, and help the vendors understand in better terms what the academic audience is interested in. And I think that's all I have, but I look forward to comments from Caitlin.
Thank you so much, Susan. It was wonderfully distilled and concise list of challenges. And to provide some reaction and additional thoughts to that is Caitlin Tillman, is the Associate Chief Librarian for Collections and Materials Management at the University of Toronto Libraries, also a participant in OCL. And so we asked for her thoughts on this in particular. Caitlin is not a GIS specialist, but she is well-versed in a variety of the issues that Susan raised. Caitlin, are you available?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Excellent. So thank you, Susan, and also thank you to CRL for giving me this opportunity to give you some comments. And these comments will be based mainly on observations I have in licensing GIS data and other data with our GIS and Maps librarian Marcel Fortier and our data librarian Leanne Trimble, both of whom are involved in the Scholars Portal project that Bernie mentioned earlier. And so I think what I'll do is I'll start by maybe underlining some of the points that Susan made, because I think that they're important for CRL members, and then maybe affirm some of the things that James mentioned earlier about possibilities for coordination and collaboration, because I think some of those things that Susan has highlighted do fit in with what James said earlier. So the first thing I would like to underline is the importance of understanding how the information will be used when licensing data, or GIS data in particular, but this is also true for any other data, because it's important to ensure that you have made it possible for researchers to manipulate the data for their purpose and also publish the results of that work. And because those terms may be unfamiliar to those who do the majority of the licensing in your institution, you really do need the subject expertise of a data or GIS or business librarian when negotiating these kinds of data licenses. That said, while I was listening to Susan, and also as part of the work that we do in licensing data here, I'm often struck by how much the licensing of data is really a partnership between the subject expert and the licensing expert. And I think that this is really important because we don't actually know all the ways that researchers may use this data in the future. So we already know that GIS data is not used by just geography departments, and that financial data is not of interest solely to the business schools. And a change in perspective could result in a change in need. So I think it's really important to stress that license terms and principles that over time we have come to think of as standard or model, things like ensuring that all members of your community can use the data, and perpetual access, things that Susan mentioned, should not be forgotten or forsaken when you're acquiring data. In addition, we also want to make sure that the use rights are not so detailed as to be limiting. For instance, it can be problematic to future research projects of which you know nothing right now, to have a license that lists in too much detail what you can do, so that it actually implies that anything not listed is not allowed. And so all I really want to stress here is that it is equally important to have subject expertise and the licensing expertise, so that we can ensure that data is acquired in a way that continues to meet the overall needs or ethos or mission of the library, the university, and the academy as a whole. And so I really do see a role for CRL supporting these kinds of licenses, particularly for its members who may not have the expertise of both, or who by organizational structure do not have those two people working together. And this is particularly important, I think, because of something James mentioned earlier, is that when you feel pressure from faculty to get immediate access to certain kinds of data sets, you may sign license agreements that have unfavorable terms, or even terms that are impossible for the university to agree to. And these are not in our best interest. Too often, I think when we're negotiating data licenses here at the University of Toronto, particularly with vendors who are not familiar with the academic market, we are told that this library or that library has agreed to this license term, so should we. And we, before more unfortunate precedents are set, I think with CRL's help there could be a more coordinated approach to create a more favorable marketplace for academic institutions. Maybe one in which vendors understand the expectations of an academic library, or at the very least help us say the same things to vendors so that we can keep them from playing us off each other. And then another comment I would like to make is one that's more general about data, and maybe speaks a little bit to Jeff's earlier comment about data with a small s, small data. And that's about the cost or the monetization of data. And I'm not sure where CRL may play a part, but I think there's something that we maybe need to think about collectively. So in the past, most of the data that we purchased, and still today some of it, is purchased directly from the producer, who may or may not have already thought about ways to monetize the data they create. But I think more and more that option to purchase the raw data that we own and keep and reuse is becoming harder and harder as we see commercial publishers make their way in this field, and they're building tools around what they would consider to be their proprietary data set and packaging that data for sale to the university, and not necessarily even to the library, but to other parts of the university, other units in the university, like the research offices. And here I'm thinking particularly about bibliometric tools like SciVal and Pure Insights and Converis, which draw their data from Scopus and Web of Science. So I think a coordinated or collaborative approach to understanding the landscape in this area, and maybe getting in front of it a little bit, would be beneficial to the academic institutions. And then I guess just by way of final comment, as is evident by the presentation that Susan gave, licensing data is complex. And with all things that are complex, the best way to deal with it is in company. So I would encourage CRL members to consider, perhaps in the ways that I have mentioned, perhaps in the ways that James has mentioned earlier, ways in which we may be able to work together to help each other. And I certainly encourage CRL to continue with these discussions.
Thank you, Caitlin. Some really interesting insights in there, I think. And, you know, I think maybe, Susan, I'd like to give you a chance to comment on anything you've heard in there that you might want to reflect on. You know, one of the things that I thought about interesting in your presentation was the nature of the sort of subscription, you know, prepackaged data versus the raw data that you're getting. What in your experience, you know, what are you seeing from your side of things?
Yeah, so I think it varies a lot, and the prepackaged data tends to be available, or the vendors who are more used to working with academic libraries, I think, tend to have more prepackaged data sets that are where it's coming sort of preformed, with often with better metadata than you might encounter with vendors who are used to selling to non-academic markets. I think one of the things that I really liked about Caitlin's comments was that that we don't know how the data use will change, and so writing licenses that are not overly restrictive, because I think our tendency is to want to include, like my inclination as a GIS and data librarian is really wanting to include, like, well, these are all the ways that we can use it, and it's good to have some reining back in to say, well, we don't know how users 10 years from now are really going to want to use the license, use the data. So I think that's a really excellent point.
Yeah, agreed. If there are any questions coming out of the audience, we can address those, but I think I didn't see any
Time for some.
pop up all the way, but we have a couple minutes left here, and we can, if you don't mind, just putting up. That was a holdover from the last comment. I'll bring that back in the final session. It sounded to me like the both Caitlin's comments and Susan's comments about the vendors who are used to dealing with us are used to dealing with it in a way that makes it easy for us. And that's very reminiscent, I think, of the first part of this conversation where I conducted it, and saying that, in dealing with the ones easiest to deal with, and Greg said, that may not be most at our advantage. You can already license that pretty easily. They have standard agreements. And so, in this aspect, the rawer the data, the newer the provider, maybe that is the area that we can affect the most change, that we can reach, have the greatest impact. Another thought that I had coming out of, Susan, your comments were a number of the licensing principles of the language that you're using, come right out of the model license language that LibLicense and Neural Model License and all of those have negotiated. But there are particular things in there that are, truly unique to the data sources, and maybe not just GIS, but some of them might be particular to GIS, like the metadata requirements. And so, I'd like the membership to reflect back on how we can best approach that. We have been collecting some feedback and comments from eDesiderata forum participants on whether they've provided any model licenses themselves towards this, or if they can provide some versions of sanitized data agreements that they've negotiated that will allow us to aggregate some of that information and put this together in a way that we could get additional feedback from McGirt, which is the Maps and Geospatial Information Group. So I think we'd like to carry this forward. We heard that there was a need for this in the fall, and there seemed to be some energy and interest behind putting this together. So we'll continue this conversation forward. Question from one of the members. Great. Bernie's going to wrap this up. There was a quick question, though, from Rachel Breckus. Asked, would it be better to list uses that are not acceptable than to list uses that are acceptable? Have you seen that particular case, Susan or Caitlin?
Caitlin, do you want to? So I guess the one thing that we try and list non-commercial use. I guess that's still a use, but it's sort of not commercial. But I'm curious, Caitlin, if you've seen anything as well.
No, I would agree with that. I think one of the things that prompts us to list all the things we want to do is when we see in a license all the things that we can't do. And I think a goal should be that it would be great if we could just say, here's the stuff, obey copyright, and everything's good. But that's not how things work with most products. So I think the idea is to remain as silent as you can on both sides of that.
Sure, yeah, just a couple thoughts that I had. It seems like, as James said, there's definitely work needs to be done in this area, and there's a couple things that are kind of CRL-like things that kind of things CRL done in the past in the print realm or the physical collections realm could do. One is provide, one is the idea of a space and opportunities for pooling of expertise and knowledge about either GIS databases and data or other kinds of data, other kinds of global data, and sharing of information about what the problems are with particular databases, platforms, resources out there. And there's a certain amount of that's been done. I guess there's a certain amount of that kind of sharing that goes on the live license listserv. and there's a certain amount that happens at Charleston conference, but I don't think very much in this area. I think those are, it's mostly, most of the chatter that goes on in the live license listserv is really about journals, like e-journals and e-books, and so it may be useful to organize a space and opportunities for this kind of thing. And I actually, that leads me into giving a plug, segue to a plug on next year's Global Collections Forum, April 19th and 20th in Chicago, face-to-face. We will meet to talk about global data, and that will be a forum for sharing of expertise, issues, problems, challenges, and ideas and opportunities around the idea of data. But during the course of the year, we do a lot of webinars. CRL does lots of webinars, and those could be crafted to provide some opportunities for sharing this kind of information. The other is tools. Aside from the space to talk and work, tools. The CRL hosts the live license list, the live license model license, and that's a relatively generic license. Licensing language that works, actually was really crafted by people who are more knowledgeable about journals and ebooks. So doing that kind of thing, it seemed to me that both Caitlin and Susan thought that there'd be space, there'd be usefulness there in crafting information or crafting language, some kinds of generic languages or for terms of license for GIS information or other kinds of information, maybe even something like defining non-commercial uses more specifically based on actual user practices that we're seeing in at the individual universities, maybe pointing to samples of derivative works, for instance, that we consider acceptable, rather than trying to define everything a priori, which, as both Caitlin and Susan pointed out, might result in excluding future uses that we don't want to exclude. So that might be. And in terms of collectivizing and advocacy, I'm not sure with the commercial vendors how much CRL can do. I think Greg's idea of bringing it, of going big or going home is a good one. We really do have to tackle the big providers, and maybe not the absolute biggest providers like Bloomberg, but the kind of mid-level providers, and create a track record in that space for negotiating on behalf of members. It might not necessarily be for a particular member, but it could be more along the lines of generic terms that we'd like to see happen. Co-investment as well. Lara Cleveland, actually, I found that quite compelling, the case for the libraries helping to support essentially what are kind of data rescue operations, the digitization of those census reports before they disappear, before the U.S. Census Bureau, which was probably the last place to hold on to them, deaccessions them. There are a number of ways that could be done, and it was Brian Skibb commented on that, and others, but I think there's real potential there, and I think CRL's role would be to organize the effort to subsidize that, to figure out what the costs, or work with IPMs to figure out what the costs would be, what the priorities are, drawing on people in the member institutions, and so forth. So I think you've given us a lot of ideas about things that we can do. Some of them may even be possible to do, and so we will be back to you on that. But we appreciate all the